Good morning, folks. Welcome. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. On behalf of BrainStorm and Neudesic, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, focusing on increasing the value of SharePoint. Today, we're going to go ahead and get started with a couple of introductions. I'm going to introduce you to two very important people that will be with us on the call today. First, we have Michael Benoit from Neudesic. He is the Director of Portals and Collaboration Practice. And then we have Derek Adams, the Vice President of Technology and Engineering from BrainStorm. Derek was kind enough to be the one to give you a couple introductions just a few minutes ago. And just a couple housekeeping items. We will start off with Michael. He will give us a portion of today's webinar and then turn the time over to Derek. If you have any questions or comments, the chat and Q&A boxes are available on your right-hand side of your screen. If at any time the presenters share their screen, you can also access those features at the top of your screen by a little drop-down that will show up as you're viewing someone else's screen. Again, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And at this time, we're going to turn the time over to Michael. Michael, the time is yours.
Thanks, Chandler. So, today's topic webinar is about increasing your the value of SharePoint, and I think one of the most important things in order to increase that value is to actually have users use your SharePoint environment, what you're deploying, and the key there is around user adoption, right? And so, what I'll be discussing is around user adoption strategy. So user adoption basically is simply about users changing the way they work, right? So you're asking them, there's an ask to change the way they work. And this occurs whether it's upgrading to a new version of SharePoint or introducing new automated processes, whatever, there is a change that's being asked. And an adoption strategy is around managing that change. So one of the quotes that I like to really to keep in mind during this adoption strategy is people don't resist change; they resist being changed. And so I think if you keep this in mind during your adoption strategy, it'll help you go a long way. So a model that was developed by ProSize Research helps basically drive an adoption strategy, and it's based on this acronym called ADKAR. ADKAR represents awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And by assessing each one of these areas, it helps structure what activities will be needed in an adoption strategy. So let's go ahead and drill down to each one of these. So awareness. Awareness is about basically communicating, what is the need for the change, right? The need for the change may be technical, like for instance, you needing to upgrade a version that's no longer supported, or there may be business reasons for the change. Business has changed, has outgrown the capabilities of the system, but to communicate that change. And also, what is the benefit to the user? Is it improved capability, ease of use, things like that? So how do we improve this awareness? One of the key factors studies have shown is the executive sponsorship is really key in an successful adoption strategy. Having the messages come from the executive leadership helps get the attention of the users and also validate that change, right? So we also want to communicate why the change is necessary, how it will benefit the users, and also communicate a schedule of what steps we'll be taking to help with this transition. Whether it's when will training occur, when will the rollout, whether it's phased, those type of details. Your goal here is to change the whys to the why not. Common whys is why fix it if it ain't broken? What's in it for me? When will this happen, and will I get trained? The next area is desire. So we've addressed the awareness, and now the question is does the user have the desire to participate in the change? And do they also have the desire to support the change and to help you deliver this change? The factors that can improve the desire is, number one, is the change easier than the old way? So naturally, if it's easier, then of course they're going to have an increased desire to do that. If it's not necessarily changing something existing, but it could be something completely new, is it a well-designed user experience? Is it going to be frustrating for the users to use? Education, this gets back to the awareness. Does the user have the desire based on the value and the benefits to the organization to be able to do this? And also another thing is that you may change a process, but you also may provide additional valuable features. When we go to SharePoint 2013, there's a plethora of additional features around social, for instance, or even search has improvements that would attract the usage and increase that adoption. Some things that I've seen in the past that I don't necessarily recommend is bribing and penalizing. This type of strategy starts to question the user's mind. If this thing is so great, how come you're having to, bribe me or penalize me? What's the value of it if you're having to use this sort of tactic? Contests, however great they are, they're short-lived, right? So if you have a contest, after the contest is over, you have new employees, you have changes to your organizations, and so they're not long-lasting or sustainable. And the other strategy I see is that organizations default the default browser homepage to your intranet, for example. And what this does is that it contributes to the perception that people are being forced to go to the intranet, and also it kills your web analytics, right? So you have no way of determining are people wanting to go to the intranet, because every time they launch their browser, you get a hit, right? So it kind of kills your web analytics from that standpoint. Now we've got the awareness, we've got the desire, so this feeds into now the knowledge. Does your user have the skills and knowledge for this change? And do they have the knowledge of what the change is actually going to look like, right? So how can we, help with that knowledge? Of course, education and training is very important here. And so is demos and screenshots. Providing that knowledge of what the change is going to look like. It also helps with the feedback during the actual development process, right? Because you can get some early feedback and maybe you have to react to some of that feedback. And also another contributor to the knowledge is the proper governance planning, which I will talk about later. So we've got the awareness, desire, knowledge, and now the question is that does a user have the ability to participate in this change? Do they have the skills necessary? And in your strategy, do you have the time? Are you allocating enough time for the users to develop these new skills? I think it's very frustrating for a user to be able to get all excited about a change, and then when they actually go use it, they really don't have the skills to do that. So I think it's very important to assess whether or not there's going to be a gap in skills and how are you going to address that. And again, have ongoing coaching and support around that. So once we've got to this point, now the question is that, we've got the users, we've got them hooked, right? They're excited, they're ready to go, they're trained up. How are we going to reinforce this change? How do we make this sustainable? And will the users tend to go back to the old ways? In some cases, they can't go back to the old ways because you replaced the system, but there's some common use cases where they can go back. A couple examples are people are moving off of file shares, for example. If you don't actually kill the file shares, there's nothing stopping users from going back to storing files in the file share. Also, another common one is that people, organizations want users to stop emailing files as attachments, right? You want to store the documents in the appropriate location in SharePoint, and then provide a link to that. Well, nothing really stops the user from still going back to their old ways. So how do we do this reinforcement, right? And so some techniques for actually doing that is through, periodic communications. I think what's really great is success stories and testimonials, especially from out in the business, out in the field, if you will, talking about how successful the particular change, the new way of doing things is. Also, recruit evangelists across the organization. Part of the governance strategy that I like to do is to recruit those evangelists, those power users in each one of the organizational units to help field those questions that are out there, and kind of be that first level of support, if you will, and also give them the ability to communicate why that awareness as well. So that helps a lot. Also, hold lunch and learns. You may want to recruit some business folks to talk about something they've done, like in their team sites, or something like that that's been very successful. Also, you may want to create an internal user group. Those have been very successful, getting participation of people to kind of share their ideas and help reinforce that the change that has occurred. Also, provide a suggestion box, and importantly, reply to all those suggestions as well to make sure that people are being heard. So, we talked about the adoption strategy. I want to kind of briefly talk about governance. So governance, there's many definitions to governance, as you can see here. But basically, governance involves the people and the processes and policies around, in this case, SharePoint. But I think the key thing here, the mantra that I like to state is that the goal of governance is to remove or clarify ambiguity. The goal is to any interaction with your system, with SharePoint, the user doesn't have ambiguity of what to do, whether it's who do I contact for help, or to what is the process for requesting X, Y, Z, or am I able to do this, or I'm able to, how do I request a new team site, those type of things. That's the goal of governance, is to remove that ambiguity. And the way we look at governance planning is in three major areas. We have IT governance, information management, and application management. And when we talk about IT governance, we're talking about those services that IT provides for SharePoint, whether it's the server software maintenance, how patches are going to be tested, what is the outage notification, what is your SLA going to be, what is your backup and disaster recovery strategy, as well as around portal administration. What are the tasks going to be and procedures for administering SharePoint? What is, for example, site retirement processes? There's administrative audits that can occur around security, site sizes, licensing, those types of things. Then we get into information management governance. We're talking about governance for not only the site architecture, whether it's the site structures or things like that, but it's also around my sites, the publishing sites, metadata, content types, who controls that, who owns that information, who owns the term store, those type of things. And then when we get into content management, it's around the policies and procedures around versioning, content approval, check-in, check-out, QA, retention policies, records management, whether or not, what is the policies around, do you have another system for handling records outside of SharePoint? When does the content go into the records management software? Things like that. And the third aspect is treating SharePoint as an application from a governance standpoint. What is how is security going to be handled in SharePoint? AD groups are going to be used, individuals, SharePoint groups, those type of things. What's going to be the naming conventions for things, right? What is the provisioning process for all the different types of objects in SharePoint, whether it's web apps, site collections, sites, those type of things? Who can create what? right? And what is the process? Then when it comes to customization, what are the development standards? What is the policies for third-party software? What is the application lifecycle management process? Who approves changes to SharePoint, and when are they applied? So another aspect of the governance is around the training and communication plan. And the communication plan is about how do we communicate these governance policies and procedures for your SharePoint environment. Sometimes I've seen people, create a very good help site in SharePoint where we actually store all the governance policies and procedures in there. Then there's a training plan that's very important. Includes what training and resources are available for various roles. Not only is it in user roles, but it's also development, administrator, technical roles. And when will the users be trained? Again, this is getting back to that adoption strategy that I talked about earlier. And then lastly, the support plan, which includes, what is the support process for end users, whether it goes through your current existing help desk, what is the escalation process, those things like that. Excuse me. So governance may seem intimidating, but it's really not that difficult. It's basically a lot of common sense. Granted, there's a lot of detail involved in there in SharePoint because SharePoint is so large and so vast of capability. And also keep in mind that your governance plan needs to be able to adapt, right? It doesn't need to be static. It needs to adapt to your organization. And as you build out SharePoint, you'll have lessons learned that you need to definitely adapt. And one of the key conflicts, if you will, that we see when you're doing governance planning is control versus user empowerment, right? So if we look at the extremes of these, if we allow users to do whatever they want, then we've got a system that we can't manage, becomes kind of the Wild West, basically no governance at all, right? Then if we do control to the extreme where users are not able to basically do anything themselves, they have to either create tickets for everything, which becomes a very burdensome system, very difficult to use, takes forever, for instance, to get a site created, those type of things. And so the key on governance planning really is around striking that balance between control and empowerment. So just to summarize what I've talked about today is that user adoption is about managing that change. And the ADKAR model is a great foundation to help you drive your strategy around adoption. And that governance planning is a key contributor to that user adoption. So today, Neudesic, we're offering a one-week session where we would come out to your organization and basically have a 1 week around upgrade planning going to 2013, where we would have we would provide a scorecard assessment, which basically is that we kind of assess where you are with your existing environment, not only technically, but from a process standpoint, from the governance standpoint. Because when we upgrade to 2013, we also want to take advantage of that process to also improve your governance and the processes around that. We also want to review your business goals and requirements. We'll look at your physical and logical architecture currently, as well as what the future may look like for 2013. We'll also consider, cloud versus on-prem, if you will. We'll look into, what's the mobility and BYOD strategy for your organization, take that into consideration, as well as consider the extranet and the partner requirements. So that's it. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Derek now.
Great, Michael. Hey, thank you so much. I can't emphasize enough the approach that Michael and Neudesic take to looking at SharePoint. Let me share a really quick story with you. At BrainStorm, we're about end-user adoption and, focused exactly on what he's looking at. Unfortunately, what we don't do, which Neudesic does so well, is that whole planning of kind of the architecture and the governance and all of that process. I was brought into a very large corporation back in New York, and they'd spent a lot of money, millions of dollars on this SharePoint deployment. And they put it out there, and they got it all done, and they said, nobody's using it. What's the problem? And so they brought us in to try and help them figure out, okay, well, how are we going to drive this adoption and this usage? Because we've invested all this money. We think it's great. And, Michael referenced a couple of, key elements in there. For example, you got to understand the business goals, and if you leave that back path back to some of these other things, they're going to go right back. But I think really at the heart of it is users understanding why. We went in this organization, it wasn't being used. So we had to really take a step back, and their mantra was, hey, let's just throw out SharePoint, and everyone's going to come and use it. And the reality is, without a lot of those pieces around of explaining and helping and getting them to understand the why versus the why not, right, that why versus why not, that was very well said, that's really a key component of this whole plan. Now, the other thing that I would mention, just as a transition story, I remember being in Chicago years ago and went in to do a training session in there, and I said, how many people in here? There's like 30 people in the room. It was going to be a hands-on session. It was going to be half a day. And I said, how many people in here are excited to be here today? No, not a single hand went up. How many of you are here because you have to be here today? Every hand in the room went up. I thought, wow, this is going to be a really long 3 hours, right? It's so critical that we can capture that vision of why we're doing it. You as an organization, I'm assuming most of you on the call today are decision makers, and you are making the decision of should we invest in this or should we not. And it's so critical to just not invest in the dollars, but invest in the dollars to achieve the objective. And repeatedly we see corporations that will make that investment and it just falls flat, and they're not ever going to get that ROI because they don't take the comprehensive look. And I just can't say enough about Neudesic as a partner of ours and that we work with, and somebody that you can turn to help with that process, to come in and take that bigger picture look rather than just looking at the bits and saying, how do I install SharePoint 2013? The governance, the processes, all of those are absolutely critical. Now, before I get too heavily into slides here, I'm going to show one, and then I'm going to jump out and do something a little different. We see here this is something we refer to as the stairway to heaven. And Michael referenced the ADKAR model. It's very, very similar to kind of the framework that we use at BrainStorm. And what we do is we look at this and say, all the time in organizations, what we'll see is they will view a transition or to SharePoint, for example, as an event. And it just doesn't have to be SharePoint. It can be any software deployment. But in this case, SharePoint, right? And they'll say, okay, we're going to go ahead and deploy SharePoint, and I need everyone to have a 1-hour webinar so they know how to use SharePoint. All right. Now, most of you probably are familiar enough with SharePoint to know that's not a very realistic objective. The other thing there is just from the standpoint of it can't be one event. Michael made reference to this ongoing development of skills. So when we look at this stairway, let me just quickly touch on these 4 points as we view them. The first is driving that affinity and awareness, and there's a lot of different tools we can do that. But to some extent, you almost have to sell your internal organization on what you're going to do. And there's a lot of different methods and tools that we can do that. But as we sit down in partnership with Neudesic and work with you, kind of figuring out what this looks like, right? Focusing on your end-user community. How do we drive that affinity? How do we get them so they're pulling the technology rather than resisting the technology like I experienced in Chicago? Obviously, the day it deploys, depending on how you deployed it, and there's a lot of different ways to deploy it. Let me make a comment about SharePoint here quickly. I think a global mass deployment of here it is today, go, generally doesn't work very well from our experience, what we've seen. SharePoint needs to solve business needs. And if you can solve business needs and business problems with it, again, that pull starts to happen. Now, it's interesting. You start to think about different solutions you can do. Let's take expense reports, for example. I'll use Microsoft as an example in this one. They used to process their expense reports for reimbursement, and to process the cost, just to process an expense report, was around $18 per expense report. I might be $1 or $2 off on this because it's been a while since I read it, but this story just came to mind. $18 to process an expense report. They started going through and automating this process of how it's done and using SharePoint as a solution, right, to automate, use workflow processing, manager approvals, everything down. Now, when you take $18 and you take, depending on the year, 60 to 90,000 employees submitting expense reports on a monthly basis, that's just overhead and expense at a very large scale, right? Scale that down to your organization, percentage numbers still work. Things like this can be very expensive. Well, now they go through, they automate this, and they get the cost somewhere down to $4 to $5 per expense report using SharePoint as that main glue engine to process expense reports. That spread, when you do the numbers, all drops right to the bottom line, right? So when we start looking at returns, that's a good example of trying to find ways to recoup your investment there. Now, the real beauty of that, the end users had a new process that they did in the community. They liked it. It was easier, fewer steps. They got paid faster, simpler, front to back. And guess what? They never even knew they were in SharePoint. So it really is interesting when we start looking at that of solving business problems can be a really good value and way to get an ROI on it, as opposed to looking maybe at, I'm just going to dump all these features out here and let my end user community figure it out. Now, that's where we start getting a little bit further down the road here is skill development and performance support, because those tools are there and they are available to end users and what they can do. Now, what they need to do is start to utilize them. So the first thing is we have to give them the ability to do it, right? The rights to do it. And that's all up to an organization. Some organizations are wide open in what they let their end users do in the SharePoint world. Others are very restrictive. And there's not a right or wrong answer, but those discussions should be had and understood of the pros and cons of that rather than just restricting that up front. And there was a lot of the governance process that Michael discussed that is applicable there. And then ongoing, let's say I get in there and I need to know how to do something. We start talking about the term in the industry is performance support. And the idea behind that performance support is exactly that, right? I need to come in here and with performance support, I need an answer right now because I've got to get this done in the next 30 minutes. I don't have time to go take a class 2 weeks from now on this. I need an answer in 2 or 3 minutes. So this process, if you will, versus an event is really kind of the framework we use, and it really models well with what Michael was talking about at Neudesic. Now, I'm going to jump out of the slides here. We'll see how this goes, and I'm going to share with you. Let's see here. Hopefully this will come up there. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to share with you just a sample SharePoint environment to kind of talk about, as an example, some of these things that we're discussing. So this is just a SharePoint 2013 environment. And I want to walk through and talk about why SharePoint is so critical and it's so critical to get right. Now, there's a lot of use cases we can talk about, but I want to talk about that kind of empowering the end users, right? That skill development, giving them the ability, both in knowledge and rights, to be able to do some of these things. This is just an example of a simple team site. Okay, many of you may have seen the Contoso demo environment from Microsoft. That's all this is here. But let's talk just about SharePoint 2013 and how some of these things come into play. So one of the things you're going to notice, Michael mentioned social in SharePoint 2013. And as you know, I go around the country and talk with organizations about what is it you're doing with social? How are you using social? And about a year and a half ago, most of them said, scares me to death. I don't know anything about it. I don't know how we're going to apply it, but we're kind of looking at it, right? That's evolving and evolving quickly as people are understanding that social in a business context means a lot more than Facebook, right? And so we start to think about this. Here's contextual information in a social setting where I can come down and see things going on that are relevant to this team site. Now, this team site happens to be about Northwind. Northwind would be a partner of Contoso. But think of that team site as being anything. And right from here, you know, I've got contact cards of people. I could email them. I could IM with them. If I had other people online, I'd be getting presents. I can reach out to them. I can see who's involved. A completely different paradigm and a way to share information. Now, let me step back and give you a setting maybe for this site. Have any of you ever been brought in late to a project, right? That's a common example I share. But think about being brought in late. How do you go about getting information there? Well, the first thing you do is probably start contacting other people in the group. So you set up, meetings, and we're going to meetings on it, and we're getting emails, and we're, doing all this. Well, what if the owner of this has left the company and now you don't even have all of his emails that were there? So we've lost there was no contextual nature to the information, okay? So here I come and I can hit Northwind and I can get absolutely everything I need to know about Northwind. Now, here's a social feed talking about this. I might come in here and I might have dashboards, right? We all love dashboards because we love to visualize the data. All of us are fantastic at going in and collecting data, but one thing we never do is actually surface the data, right, and make it actionable. So here's, simple things that we can drive in and see, and I can see where our issues. Boy, units sold is really where our issue is. We're missing our marks on there, so I can dig in and see the data and where we're at there. Coming down through documents, Michael mentioned file shares. That's a very common thing that people will as a starting point for SharePoint is let's get them contextually organized within SharePoint, but there's so much more that I can do with them once they get up there. For example, once they are in here, I've got the ability to come in and take a look, and I can, hit these things. I can use web apps. I can co-author. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but this is the value of as I'm working together as a team and accessing something, right? No more check-in, check-out if you're on SharePoint 2010 or 2007. We can all just collectively access this at any time. And this is going to be a slow one to pull up. I apologize. There we go. Pull up in the web app here. I can come in. I can edit it in the web app. I can edit it in PowerPoint. Other people can be doing it at the same time I'm doing it, right? So this power of how I'm working, not only getting the information contextual, but then how I'm working on the information with other people. Now, there's a couple other things I want to surface as well, and I'm driving to a point here we'll get to right at the end. But here's something called a site mailbox. So when you think about emails, that is really the primary means of communication. When I go around and ask everybody, where do you spend your time every day? Everyone says, in my email software. Well, what happens is, again, everything gets stuck in our email. And so one of the things that comes about here is this idea of what about a site mailbox? And so I can either just CC things to the site, right? So just get that information there. We're not trying to create additional repositories of information. What we're trying to do is easily surface it in a contextual fashion. I can, right from Outlook, have access to this. This is the really cool thing in there. I get in there in Outlook. I can just drag and drop emails from my inbox into this shared site. And sorry, I don't have that Outlook tied to this account to show you that. If there's an attachment, the attachment automatically just gets dumped into documents in the site, right? So a very simple way, again, I don't even know that I'm in SharePoint, but here I am using SharePoint as a repository, right, that I can go in and keep information contextual in something like a site mailbox. Newsfeed, social, notebooks. Boy, if you don't use OneNote, that's really interesting, but let's think about how you go to meetings and how you take notes on meetings and how you take action items and what happens with those and how we share them. Right, to have a central repository or location where all of that happens to be shared, and we can, again, co-author on that. All of us can be in there at the same time. It'll actually even take logs of saying, here's who attended the meeting automatically based upon, your Link meeting, if you're using Link, for example. So some very powerful things in there. Lastly, just reporting and dashboarding, and I won't take time to go in there. We already talked about dashboarding. Now, here's an example of a team site. Now, why is it so critical to get SharePoint right, would be the question I would throw out with there. And, maybe there's some new things that you saw there. Maybe you haven't spent much time in SharePoint 2013. Maybe you have. But what I'd like you to think about is how many technologies that we just touched and how many ways that we can, surface things. When we talk about that, there's everything from Link and instant communications and presence to emails and what we're doing with Exchange to all of our Office applications to all the web apps, to Visio, to OneNote, right, to a whole complete social strategy that we lay out. So when we look at all that perspective, SharePoint really becomes the central hub or the glue, if you will, for all the other technologies and a way to surface those. Now, obviously, you can access things different ways. I get that. But at the core, when you look at it, really there is something fundamentally there about SharePoint and getting it right, okay? I can't emphasize that enough, getting it right. And that is exactly kind of, again, going back to the points that Michael was driving home initially, that's so critical about that of planning and governance and understanding that and, again, solving the problems, the business goals of the organization. Very good. So moving on. BrainStorm, as I mentioned, that stairway in that process, we have a lot of different solutions and ways that we try and drive and really assist users to get adoption. And Quick Help is one of those ways of doing that. Now, Quick Help is essentially a big, huge repository of a whole bunch of little 2 to 3 minute video clips that tell you just about everything. So if you want to know how to do a timeline in SharePoint, it's going to show you how to do that. You want to know how to use a site mailbox, set up a site mailbox, it's going to show you how to do that. Manage tasks or sync your tasks to Outlook from SharePoint sites, or use your SkyDrive Pro, or share documents, or co-author documents. All of those, and the ability to take those and give you exactly the information you're needing in a 2 to 3 minute bite-sized segment, right? Now you can string those together and really get a comprehensive look. But what a great way as we talk about that skill development and also that ongoing performance support. Now, the flip side is initially for that, how do I get started? And with Quick Help, one of the things we do is put together courses, right, or playlists. So I'm going to go and compile, here's the 10 things that are absolutely critical for you and my organization to know. Or you're going to be a site owner in SharePoint. Here happens to be 6 videos. It'll take you 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that's going to show you exactly what you need to know about being a site owner and some of these tools that are available to you to help develop the ability that Michael was talking about. Now, one of the things we do with Quick Help is, people we're lazy by nature, I guess. That's probably harsh. I shouldn't say lazy by nature. But end users, when it comes to finding answers or finding solutions, tend to be like water and gravity. Okay? And that is they're going to use whatever is the easiest thing for them to get to. That's just the way it works. And the reason, I guess lazy is not the right word, ultimately, the reason they do that is they just want to get their job done, and so they can go home. And, when you go in and you're deploying new solutions such as SharePoint, one of the common things you hear back is, well, why did I change? This is just adding headaches to me, right? Well, no, it's actually a better way to work, but that change process, sometimes there's a bit of an investment to be made by end users. Now, where that relates to this is we want to make this as easy as possible. So whether we're talking about Windows, there's a Windows 8 app, right, that's readily accessible. So you're in Windows 8 right there, there's a single click, you're using it. If you're in Office, you happen to be in Outlook, you happen to be in Excel, you want to know how to visualize data, you want to know how to create reports, dashboards that can be shared in SharePoint. Right within Excel in the ribbon, click, I can get the video right there. Within SharePoint, surfacing apps directly within SharePoint, making those available. And of course, there's just a web portal as well that people can go to and access that information with Quick Help. Now, another thing that BrainStorm is very commonly known for is Quick Start cards. And these are a great point of reference. And the challenge that we always give to people, it's fantastic. Hand them a Quick Start card on an application and say, if you don't learn something in this, these are advanced users. We even do this at Microsoft. It's great. Go up to Microsoft. I met with the product team last week up at Microsoft. Handed them a card and said, I want you to look at this. If you don't learn something from this, I'll buy you lunch. And within about 30 seconds, they're like, I didn't know it did that, right? It's amazing the value and the power, not only as a Deployment Monday tool to help me get through this, but having this very warm, friendly, instructional way to tear down those barriers, if you will, to adoption, saying, wow, this looks interesting, this looks really good, to also just learning some of those long-term skills. All right. Next is, let's say that you get in there and you're frustrated, you can't figure out how to do something as an end user, and you just need a quick answer. So 24/7 support, being able to pick up the phone and within 2 rings have somebody answer and say, nope, absolutely. Let me show you how to do it. Not only let me show you how to do it, but you know what? Maybe there's a better tool that you could be using. So that's kind of the when you don't know what you don't know type of a thing, and you're in a very specific scenario or stuck on something, that's where this phone help can really make a big difference of being able to assist that, right? Now, all the planning and the technical governance and everything is absolutely critical piece because we got to get it right so that our end users can have the good experience, but we can't forget about the end users needing to have access to some help to understand how to do these things. Last is some instructor-led training is something else that we do. We can come on site to your organization. We can work with your help desk folks. We can even do geographically things. We can work with people in different departments, and so there's always somebody that's 3 cubicles down that you can say, hey, how did you do this, or how do we do this, right? So you get kind of geographical representation of expertise there that people can turn to, and that's another great model to help in that as you're deploying and overcoming some of the challenges. So from BrainStorm standpoint, we've got a free 45-day jumpstart trial, if you will. So there's Quick Start cards for SharePoint 2013. There's Quick Help that plugs right in. You can be up and running within that, whether you're running SharePoint online in Office 365 or on-prem. be up and running in about 5 to 10 minutes with that. And for attending today, we'd certainly like to make that offer available to everyone. Details of that will be forthcoming. The biggest thing, though, is to get some ideas about what your options are and stop thinking about so much of, I've got to get it installed and I'm going to turn it live and that's it. You've got to take a look at the bigger picture. So this is some next steps here. Absolutely, we certainly appreciate Michael from Neudesic joining us today, and BrainStorm here as well. Here's contact information. You'll also receive a follow-up email with contact information about the offers that Michael was sharing, as well as BrainStorm. So for your next steps and what you'd like to do, and that's it. I would just say SharePoint is amazing, and when it's deployed right and done right, it changes the way you do business. Absolutely. So let's turn and see. Chandler, did you have any questions at all?
Yeah, folks, again, thank you for joining. We have just a couple quick questions, Derek and Michael, if with the last few minutes here on the webinar, if you don't mind fielding a couple. First question, and I believe this will be for Michael. Derek, feel free to chime in, is do you have a best practice business roadmap, such as helping us define metadata strategies for our organization?
We have a couple of as far as formalized documents, no, but we do have a process for doing that. We do see that as a common issue that people are trying to address is that what is that metadata strategy, and we address that in our governance planning. So I'd be happy to, if you can forward your contact information and talk to you more about that. As far as what is the strategy is, I'm assuming you're asking around, the ownership, what is the change management around that enterprise taxonomy that touches many systems, and SharePoint's not just one of them. And so we definitely see that as a challenge.
Great. We have another question, and Derek, I'll let you field this one. In addition, social media is moving into our workplace. We must provide a modern approach to working together, such as the creation of special interest groups to share knowledge or projects, aka recycling knowledge. Any thoughts?
I think you're just talking, about what it can do for you. There's a real paradigm shift about the way we work, and when we look at, I'll just give a quick example of this, the training industry. BrainStorm's been around in this business for a lot of years, I think 17, 18 years now, something like that. And it used to be all the time, I want you to come in and teach me a 3-day class on Excel. So come in 3 days, I want you to teach me every button and click you can do in Excel. And that's changed dramatically. People don't work that way anymore. People don't think that way anymore. They want to use just the tool for the things that are relevant to them and learn and work differently. So when we start talking about that special interest groups, right, think about the way that we work today. We create these cross teams where we're pulling experts around the organization that get together to focus on a project, right? And that team will be dissolved 2 months from now, and you're on a team with completely different people. Even creating a special interest, right? So let's even talk about culture in an organization and the important role that culture has played. That's really, really compelling. When you start looking at the competitive nature of hiring these days, look at those top-tier organizations hiring, and one of the big cards they play that they lead with all the time is the culture of the organization. Now, so you start thinking about this and you say, well, okay, we need to deploy this, we need to use this. There's a lot of tools out there. The real advantage when you start looking at SharePoint and even Yammer from Microsoft and how those integrate and plays a role in that is now I'm using a tool, number one, that's integrated and part of what I'm already doing, but number two, I have control over. One of the common things we see, and this is, sorry, going off on a little bit of a tangent, one of the common things we see is users are using these sorts of tools to air things and to get together and everything else. And if they don't have the resources or the tools being provided by the organization, they go outside the organization to use those tools. And so you might as well provide them the best solution and be able to control it and have governance over it, but and take credit for that and all the upsides along there than kind of letting it just go run free and wild, I guess would be my thoughts on there. So absolutely. And that's I mentioned that evolution about social and how a year and a half ago nobody knew what to do with it. And now organizations that's a lot of times one of their top IT initiatives is to get social in place for the organization.
So one of the things I'd like to add is that I'm here in Houston, which a lot of my customers are oil and gas. And one of the problems that they face is that they're starting to see a lot of retirees about to retire, and how do they capture that knowledge before they leave the door for the next generation, right? And so part of that is to establish communities of practice, those type of things, to be able to share that information. And I kind of joke because those people that are retiring are the ones that are least likely to embrace all this new social technology. And the key there is to, unfortunately, gets back to what I was saying before, which is to basically explain, give them the awareness and the desire of the benefits of capturing this information. Because these retirees want to share this information. It's not like they don't want to share. It's just that they feel that a lot of times that they're repeating themselves or the information is not going to be looked at. So being able to capture that information before they retire in a way that becomes a knowledge base, becomes the passing the baton on, if you will, is very key here in Houston, for example.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Derek, for answering those questions. I know we have a few more, but it looks like we're over on time. We want to be respectful of that. Folks, thank you so much for joining. If you have further questions, comments, have more interest on both of the offers shared today by both Neudesic and BrainStorm, we're absolutely more than happy to field those questions, answer any concerns that you may have. As you can see here on this slide, our contact information is posted. We will share both this recording and the PowerPoint to those of you in attendance and those that may not have been able to make it, so that you can review at a later date. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a part of today's webinar, and please reach out to us if you have any comments or questions. At Neudesic and BrainStorm, we're your SharePoint team, and we're just as interested in you as you are in increasing the value of your SharePoint deployment and increasing end-user adoption. So once again, thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.